Where is the monetary opportunity when it comes to investing in cybersecurity? Is that protecting big corporations? Is that protecting governments? Where is that next big play?
Whenever I get asked about cybersecurity, the sad truth of it is there's no shortage of bad guys, and they're going to come up with a new way to do this. So I started in my career almost 30 years ago in cybersecurity, and the reality is here I am today, and I'm still in it. I mean, and the reality is it just keeps going. There's no shortage of those bad guys. There's always a new approach. So it's not one of those markets that's you're gonna miss it. When I was doing the VC thing, we looked really hard at like 3D printing. It was really cool, brand new technology, really fascinating. But today it's kind of it's old hat. Our junior high kids having to use it for projects in school. But that market really has kind of gone by. And there's a lot of markets that you see get really hot and then they go somewhere else. Cybersecurity is one of those ones that's really stood the test of time. It's still there. There are still bad guys. So I think in terms of from an investor perspective, this was always an area that I liked. I knew about it, but it was persistent. It was never going to go away. I do think the thing that makes this particular opportunity interesting to me is that it's not a contrarian approach because it's not against it, but it is a different way of actually providing value to the companies who are actually buying it. And most of the security spend that you're going to find out there is not coming from individuals. It's not you and me actually putting something on our laptops. That happens, but that's not really where the money is and where the market's going. It's corporations. It's the global 5,000 and all the folks that deal with them. That's actually where you're finding most of the spend.
We'd like to thank Olympia Trust Company for sponsoring this episode. Olympia's corporate and shareholder services division is a proud supporter of the capital markets and provides transfer agent and corporate trustee services to both public and private issuers. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining today. How you doing?
Doing well. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And you're being here from Southern California, is that right?
Southern California, just north of Los Angeles. Yeah.
Love it, man. Love it. So I'd love to kick things off by just getting a little bit of background into your career and how you kind of came into the position that you're in now.
Sure. I mean, it's kind of I don't know if it's a super exciting story, but I got out of my undergrad with a degree in applied mathematics, and I couldn't find anybody that was going to pay me to do math problems for a living. So I figured, all right, software is pretty close. So I jumped into the software world, and I found myself just kind of out of pure luck in the security space. I worked for a company called Symantec, the guys who make all the Norton products, and really kind of got into the deep end of the security pool. It was something that was pretty interesting to me. Really enjoyed it. There was no shortage of bad guys, so there was a lot of kind of market demand for no matter what you did, there was always something for it. I did that for about 7 years, and then I thought, I've run all this great stuff for Symantec. I'm going to do it for myself. So being a young, hotshot 27-year-old, I figured I'm going to go and raise a bunch of venture capital and change the world. So I raised a bunch of venture capital. I didn't change the world. I very quickly was kind of handed my lunch. I learned a lot the hard way in doing that, but I was fortunate enough to actually exit that company. We did relatively well with that, and I kind of got the bug. I really enjoyed the venture capital side of things. I did a couple more companies as CEO, raised some money, was fortunate enough to sell those. And then I actually got a chance to kind of flip sides of the table. I went over to the other side. I actually became a partner at a venture capital firm here in Southern California. I wish I'd done that first because it made it a lot easier to raise money once you realize what people on the other side of the table were thinking. So
No kidding.
I did that for about 7 years. Did a lot of early stage technology deals like you might expect, the deals that I was funding on the other side. And then I broke the only promise that I think I've ever broken to my wife after that, which was, dear, I'll never go back and do the two guys in a garage once again with a business plan and start something from scratch. So after the venture capital thing, I did jump in one more time, did another early stage startup in the security space, raised a bunch of venture capital for that, and was again fortunate enough to exit that company. So that's kind of where I've been. It's always been pretty much in the security space. I've played on both sides of the funding, so I understand the entrepreneurial side, I understand the institutional side, and it's made for an interesting ride, I'll have to admit.
It is so interesting when you have sat on both sides. I've sat on both sides, not to the same extent that you have, but it does really open your eyes. And once you actually are on the receiving end, it's become so much more obvious of kind of how to pitch your story and what the investors need to hear. It's so easy for an entrepreneur to get lost in their own business and really not even know how to tell the story after a while.
It's very true. I mean, I get asked all the time, hey, I'm ready to raise some venture capital. Do you know some guys that I should go talk to? And they think that that's the end of the conversation. Well, you must know people, so who should I go talk to? And I normally launch into this explanation of like, well, what stage company are you talking about? What kind of money do you want? And have you looked at VCs to know if they have a competing company in their portfolio? Are they at the early stage of their fund, or are they at the later stage of their fund? Are they harvesting, or are they investing? I mean, there's 1,000 questions that go along with that.
Totally.
And until you actually look at it from that perspective, I don't know that you quite have that appreciation. And I was guilty of this. I went out there and said, well, I need to raise some money. Let me go ask people with money, for some of their money, and never thought about, well, what stage am I at? What risk do I represent? Am I actually attractive to them? So I think that when you actually put the two sides of it together, you get a lot more effective and efficient at raising money and also handing money out. You pick deals at the right stage, the right time, the right risk profile for your clients. So yeah, it really helps knowing that. I wish that they had taught us that early on instead of having to learn it the hard way.
Typically, that's where you learn the most. So I suppose.
Very true.
I'm very curious, when you did first leave Norton, you found your own opportunity. How did you identify that opportunity? And
No, I mean, it's kind of an interesting story. So when I was at Symantec doing the Norton stuff, we built a product that was in the early days of network management. You kind of got to go back to the 90s, but we solved a particular problem for network connected computers, network connected PCs. And we did really well with it, sold a lot. We did about $50 million in business with that particular product. And every time I would go and talk to customers, they would say, this is great, we love this stuff, but we've got maybe 5 or 10% of our workforce that's not network connected. They're salespeople working from home, they're out in the field, they're doing things like that. Mind you, this is in the 90s, so this is clearly pre-pandemic and the idea of remote workers. But we've got people with laptops and stuff like that and PDAs now that are getting smarter and smarter. We need to figure out how to manage those things. Do you guys have a product for that? And we kind of went back to the engineers and they said, well, we don't. We're not going to do it. We don't have enough time to do this. It's a great opportunity, but we're not going to capitalize on it. I actually went to Symantec and I said, hey, would you guys give me your blessing to go and do this off to the side? And they said, they were very good about it, said, hey, we wish you the best. Let's do it under the right way, the right rules, and so forth. But they were actually one of the biggest supporters of me going with 2 other guys from Symantec, stepping out, raising our own independent money. Symantec didn't have any money in it, and starting a company to do that. So it really was driven by customers that we already had, that were already selling a product to, that said, we would really, really like it if you would do this other thing for all these mobile and PDAs and different devices and stuff. Little did we know at the time that it was actually going to be the beginning of that boom of everyone's got a laptop, everyone's got a phone. So it's kind of the right place at the right time. But that's really how we started with our idea, and how Symantec, they didn't kick us out, they kind of sent us out knowingly and willingly, which was really helpful.
Interesting. And so when you first went to raise money, how many times did you get shut down?
Well, I can still remember the very first one I ever went to was Brentwood Associates with Brad Jones, who's a really great guy. And I went in there. I was, of course, hotshot, young 27-year-old CEO. I knew everything that there was to know. And I went in there, and Brad very graciously put me in my place and explained to me what I didn't know. And to this day, I actually really, in one sense, cherish his politeness and professionalism in putting me in my place. But I realized what I didn't know. And at that point, it was really one of those things that you do begin to see, okay, I can enumerate the things that I know, but I don't know what I don't know. And it really did kind of open the eyes there. So we were fortunate enough to actually have a pretty concise message, a pretty discrete product, product market fit. We knew what we were doing in that area. Once I took a good dose of humble pie and actually kind of learned how to pitch VCs, we went to about 10 folks that we talked to and actually got term sheets from 3 of them. So it was actually what I would consider a really pretty good hit rate, actually getting that. Good environment. I can't say it was because of master planning or my magnificent golden tongue in this. No, it was really getting dealt a good dose of reality. It was a good time. We had some very understanding, very gracious VCs that I still hold in very high regard to this day.
Interesting. So now, with all this experience and knowledge, I'm really curious, how has the landscape of cybersecurity changed since you first got into it to where it is now?
It's funny that you asked, because some things have changed dramatically. I mean, the things that we were worried about back then and the things we're worried about now, you have to remember that was when I first started. That was pre-internet. I mean, we were talking about viruses that went on floppy disks that you left in your computer. And that was really the beginning of security at that point in time. Today, we're talking about an entirely different world. You're talking about an attack surface that is now represented by the internet. You can get attacked every different which what way. So in one sense, it's changed dramatically. The attack surface, the ability for the bad guys to get in is huge. At the same time, some things never change. And the reality is you've got a bunch of bad guys who are trying to do something. They may be trying to spray paint their name on the wall and get their 15 minutes of fame. They may be trying to get something monetary out of it. But there's no shortage of bad guys. And every generation they come out, every year there's another group of them. They've got different techniques, different approaches, and so forth, but they're still trying to do largely the same things. So it is kind of interesting how much it's changed and how much it stayed the same really over the past almost 30 years that I've been in the space.
Sure, as technology advances, they advance, and then the defense advances, and on it goes. And I suppose in the dark web now as well, there's more community forums, there's more information sharing of how to attack. And so, how do you get in there and understand these hackers' new strategies before they deploy them?
Sure. So, I mean, there's one thing that I don't know if I've coined this expression, but I repeat it often, which is that the bad guys, the hackers that we're all talking about here, they may be immoral, but they're not irrational. And what I mean by that is if they're immoral, they're doing bad things. I think everyone can agree with that. But the reality is they're rational. They're not doing it for no reason. They're doing it for a very specific and discrete reason. And if they're doing it on purpose and they're rational, if they're rational, they're predictable. And I think that that's the thing that I'm trying to draw this conclusion between they're bad guys. We all agree on that, but they're rational bad guys. And if they're rational, they're predictable. And it goes back to, I think maybe I'm dating myself here, but it's the old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Predator, where he says, if it bleeds, it can die. And it's a little bit of that. If it's rational, it's predictable. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm seeing start to come out. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about what I'm doing right now is that if they're rational, then they're predictable. Well, how can you predict what they're going to do, where they're going to be? And I think that that's actually, as I kind of look at my crystal ball and see how the security world is going to change going forward, there's no shortage of bad guys. They're going to continue to do these things. They're going to come up with a new way to do it, but they're always going for some particular goal. And if I know what they're going for, it makes it easier for me to insert myself in there and say, I know you're going over there. Let me insert myself in between, and I can be more effective at actually stopping that. There's a lot of vendors out there right now that are creating, we talk about as being plywood. I know it sounds weird, but when you're talking about boarding up windows and doors, and how do I keep the bad guys out? Most vendors are busy building plywood. Think of the hurricane mentality is that the storm's coming. I got to board it up. I got to keep the bad guys out. I got to keep the storm out. They're selling plywood. Our plywood will board up your doors and windows better than somebody else's. I think what I'm trying to look at going forward is how do we actually predict where the storm's coming from? Because if I put plywood on this side of the house, but the storm's coming from this side, that plywood may be very ineffective. If I get it on the right side, I'm actually going to be much more effective with a much more targeted defense. So I think that that's kind of, if I were to look at how I see the market morphing and changing, that's one of the things that I find pretty interesting.
So really, what I'm hearing is I identify. It's more of a targeted identification into these problems than just more of like this broad kind of solution, sort of like let's get more
It really
specific,
is.
dial in the technology a bit more.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's great technology out there. I mean, there are a bunch of fantastic vendors, some very, very smart people. And if you give
Yeah.
them a particular window, sticking with that same metaphor, they can really defend that window well. And they can make sure that
Right.
nothing gets in that particular window. But what if there's a different window somewhere else that you didn't know about, or you don't have those defenses or that plywood deployed there? You have this one over here that's wide open. And the
Yeah.
bad guys, they tend to know that and they'll find that open window. So I think that it actually becomes less and less today about those tools, that plywood. Most
Right.
CISOs that you talk to, the chief information security officers, are like, look, I get bombarded all day by people who are saying, I've got better plywood than the next guy. And, there's some merit to that. What they're not getting, and the thing that's been very interesting to them when they start leaning in, is when you say, I can tell you where to put that plywood. And they're like, okay, now wait, this is different. I haven't heard this before. This is something that doesn't nullify my current investment, what I've already done and I've already spent. The last thing I want to hear is all that money you spent on that other vendor's product, that was a bad choice. You should have spent it on ours. That's not a way to really win friends and influence people from a security perspective. The
Sure.
investment that they've already made is really good, but the way to use it and where to use it and where to deploy it, that's all of a sudden very, very interesting.
And then, so what part of the technology has enabled you to identify this instead of just building the plywood? How do you kind of go about that?
Yeah, so this is I mean, there's a couple of interesting stories that go with this. So I think that this really is a combination of what we call a combination of AI and HI. And it's like, well, we all know what
Okay.
AI is, artificial intelligence, but HI, human intelligence. I mean, there's an element of
Oh,
that too. And
never heard of it.
there's a story that I love to tell when it comes to this, which is in the late 60s, the United States Navy had its second nuclear sub, the USS Scorpion. And it was coming from the Mediterranean Sea across the Atlantic back to Virginia, where it was stationed. And halfway across the Atlantic, the Navy lost it. Didn't know what happened to it. And they feared that it was lost. It was a nuclear sub. It's the middle of the Cold War. and the government's very concerned about losing the sub. So they get the best oceanographers and chart and map guys and currents and all this kind of stuff, these modeling guys. They say, okay, well, we knew it was heading this direction at this date, at this speed. Where is it, given the currents and so forth? And they came up with a big search area. And in that search area, they looked for like 3 months, for a long time, and they couldn't find it. And finally, kind of as a last-ditch effort, they actually took 400 submariners, guys who as a career had worked on submarines, and they gave them all the same information. And they gave them a big map. And this is all independent. All these guys did it by themselves. They gave them a big map and they said, put a red X where you think we should look. Where is this sub going to be? And they got 400 guys to put these big red X's on a map. And then they pulled them all back in and they aggregated, laid everything on top of each other. And they came up with this huge cluster of red X's in an area that was way, way far away from where the oceanographers were telling them to look. And they went and looked in that area. And mind you, they'd looked for 3 months the old way, for 3 days, and then they found it in this particular area. And they went back to all these submariners and they said, well, why did we found it? That's great, but why should we have looked there? And they're like, I don't know. They basically came back and said, it's a gut feel. I don't really know. I didn't do some calculation. It's just a gut feel. Having been in a submarine for 20 years of my career times 400 guys, we thought it would be here. And when they did that, all of a sudden they realized, hey, there's something about that gut feel. There's something about that human element that comes through. And they actually found it that way. But that same thing really does apply, ironically, to the security space. So being able to take not 400 submariners, but 400 CISOs or security experts and say, hey, where do you think the next attack's coming from? What do you think that the conflict in Ukraine is actually going to do? What about this? What about that? What about certain world events? What do you think is going to be next and where is it going to happen? And you're going to get a surprising response from folks that are saying, hey, here are some indiscernible patterns that we just, in our gut, we know. And we're going to put a big red X somewhere. That's the HI part of the equation. The AI part of the equation is there's a huge amount of data out there right now. When you look at all the breaches and everything that has to get reported and everything that's out there, it's enormous. It's too big for any of us to go through and say, well, I can see a pattern in there. That's where you have to use AI and say, great, digest this wealth of information, this wealth of knowledge and patterns, and find the patterns that we can't see with our eyes. Find the ones that are in the data that are telling us something, we just don't know what it is. And when you can take the HI, the human intelligence, and you can take the AI, the artificial intelligence, put the two of those together, you get a very, very accurate predictive model of, okay, well, what's going on and where should we put that plywood up? On this side of the house or this side of the house? What should we do?
Right. Very interesting. So you mentioned Russia, Ukraine, different patterns. What are some of the current trends and patterns of how are these hackers getting into these companies or governments? Yeah.
No, well, so I would loosely broadly categorize it into at least two types of information. There's two things that influence where the bad guys go. One really doesn't change. If you think about what they're going after, they're always going after something of value. I want to get something out of this. The days of I just want to break in and I want to spray paint my name across, someone's web page, their homepage, those days are really for the most part gone. They're looking to get something monetary out of it. Well, if I want to get something monetary out of it, why don't I go to Fort Knox in the US because it's got billions of dollars in gold? Well, gold's hard to move. It's really, really well defended. And that's just impossible. Okay, well, let's go after nuclear secrets or nuclear materials. Well, highly valuable, but the reality is there's only a couple buyers in the whole world for something like that. And it's really hard to move that stuff around. But if you go to the other extreme and say, well, credit cards, they're highly liquid. No one's going to miss it. I can store literally millions and millions of them on a thumb drive. I can move it very easily. I can do it digitally. So you look at certain characteristics that are the attractiveness of the target. I'm not going to go try and knock off Fort Knox, but I'll get a whole bunch of credit cards that might be worth pretty close to what that is. I can move that data easier. So there are some things that don't change, and those are the things that are relatively static. I'm going after something of monetary value that's easily movable, easily liquidatable. It can't be traced back to me. The whole idea of cryptocurrency makes that a lot easier. So that stuff is one thing. There's also call it the geopolitical perspective. And that's the part that does change. And it really changes on a daily basis. And that's why you can't just make a recommendation that says, put your plywood on this side of the house and it'll be good there for the next year. Well, storms come frequently and they may come from a different direction. So when you consider how the geopolitical space changes on a day-to-day basis, we've seen it with stuff in Ukraine, we've seen it in the US, we see it all over the place. Those different events, maybe it's a war, maybe it's a statement by Apple, maybe it's a privacy thing when Apple introduces iOS 15. It could be any number of things, but those are things that happen on a very frequent basis. They happen daily. And
Yeah.
it changes the focus of where the bad guys are looking. They're very opportunistic. Oh, look, here's something over here that now is popular. We didn't even know about. We're going to go there. This is now valuable. We didn't know about this before. NFTs didn't exist 2 years ago for the most part.
Yeah.
That's something that all of a sudden changed. It's very, very interesting. So some things don't change, some things do change. And that's what really gets these guys to target.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like I got so many questions. So how is crypto then influenced? Is there now more hacking? Is it easier to hack now with transactions and maybe getting paid by?
It's a lot easier to get paid. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the biggest, most common things you'll see is ransomware.
Yeah.
The bad guy gets into your organization, he encrypts all of your stuff.
Yeah.
And if you want to get it back, you got to pay him.
Yeah.
That's actually existed for quite some time. The
Yeah.
thing that cryptocurrency has done is it has allowed the bad guys to get payment not in a certified cashier's check or a bag of cash getting dropped off somewhere where they can get found and caught. It's
Right.
anonymous. It can't get traced. It's a push of a button and it moves those funds. So the reward, really, if you will, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is much, much easier to get because of that. Crypto's had a lot of great uses, but that is definitely one that the bad guys are looking at saying, hey, makes it a lot easier for us to actually monetize what we're doing.
And from an investor's lens, like a lot of people who are listening right now, they want to know what the next big play is. So maybe it's cybersecurity. Where is the monetary opportunity when it comes to investing in cybersecurity? Is that protecting big corporations? Is that protecting governments? Where is that next big play?
I think that one of the things, whenever I get asked about cybersecurity, the sad truth of it is there's no shortage of bad guys, and they're going to come up with a new way to do this. So I started in my career almost 30 years ago in cybersecurity, and the reality is here I am today, and I'm still in it. I mean, and the reality is it just keeps going. There's no shortage of those bad guys. There's always a new approach. So it's not one of those markets that's you're gonna miss it. When I was doing the VC thing, we looked really hard at like 3D printing. It was really cool, brand new technology, really fascinating. But today it's old hat. Our junior high kids haven't used it for projects in school. But that market really has kind of gone by. And there's a lot of markets that you see get really hot and then they go somewhere else.
Okay.
Cybersecurity is one of those ones that's really stood the test of time. It's still there. There are still bad guys. So I think in terms of from an investor perspective, this was always an area that I liked. I knew about it, but it was persistent. It was never going to go away. I do think the thing that makes this particular opportunity interesting to me is that it's not a contrarian approach because it's not against it, but it is a different way of actually providing value to the companies who are actually buying it. And most of the security spend that you're going to find out there is not coming from individuals. It's not you and me actually putting something on our laptops. That happens, but that's not really where the money is and where the market's going. It's corporations. It's the Global 5,000 and all the folks that deal with them. That's actually where you're finding most of the spend. And because we live in such an interconnected and interdependent world, Disney, if you pick on Disney doesn't have to worry about defending its own four walls. Disney has to worry about the 27,000 vendors and partners and suppliers that they have that provide everything from IT services to video editing services to the supplies they use at their theme parks.
Yeah.
All of those vendors and suppliers and partners represent a means to get into Disney. And that's where you're seeing a lot is because we live in such an interconnected world, the problem's not getting smaller, it's only getting bigger and it's getting harder to solve. So the ability to go in from an investor perspective and say, okay, good market, contrarian approach, or it's not just putting the plywood up, it's where to put the plywood. It's a different approach. It actually also helps make the plywood more valuable. No one's going in and saying, oh, you bought the wrong brand of plywood, you should have bought ours. That's not a fun sale. It's really not.
No.
And it's a good way to get kicked out of these offices, going and saying that $4 million you spent last quarter, that was a mistake. That's not a good move. But going in and saying, I can take the $4 million that you spent last quarter and I can make it that much more valuable and the rest of your spend, that all of a sudden, for me, if I put the old VC hat back on, that starts checking the boxes of, okay, good market, unique, defensible, contrarian. I mean, that's actually what I like to see.
Do you have any idea what a company like Disney would be spending, what their budget for cybersecurity would be a year or something?
Yes, Disney spends an awful lot of money. I think that Disney does a very good job in one sense of they spend money for the right reasons. There are, again, this gets into Jonathan's philosophy, but there's a company that is driven by compliance. And I'll pick on, say, the healthcare industry. Doctors don't care about losing your patient information.
Right.
They care about getting fined for losing your patient information. It's not that doctors are bad people, but the reality is it's not that they have any beef with that information getting out. They just don't want to get fined for it. So that's their incentive. And typically for that, their motivation is I want to get the cheapest, quickest, easiest solution that will allow me plausible deniability. I did what I was supposed to do. Something still happened, but look, I bought this software and I should be covered. Disney, on the other hand, they don't care about that. They care about if the next Marvel movie gets out early, it's going to cost us, 150, $200 million in box office receipts because that got out early. How much am I willing to spend to keep that from happening? And that all of a sudden turns into a very different motivation. So the amount of money that a Disney will spend is measured literally in the hundreds of millions of dollars for cybersecurity, anti-threat cybersecurity, as opposed to someone who's saying, well, unfortunately, the government's making me do this. I have to buy something. So what's the cheapest, quickest, easiest, smallest that I can do to check a particular box? And that's why I think you're going to see a bifurcation of companies that do it because they have to, and companies do it because they want to or they need to. It has a monetary value for it. And that's where you look at people saying, hey, if you can help me make my existing investment more valuable because I care about security, that's a really, really good customer to have.
Well, you're always, speaking again about sitting on both sides of the table, what does the guy who's writing the checks wants to see? They want to see that their downside is protected and that the entrepreneur has thought about that. Having a cybersecurity plan is probably pretty smart in a variety of cases, obviously.
Very true.
Wow. So that's really interesting. I think I heard somewhere that the total market opportunity is like 250 billion or more than that, right? You can imagine.
Again, it depends on how you measure it, but it is,
Sure.
it's one of those things that it is, I don't believe that the upper end of it is capped. Normally when we go through and you get some of the better analysts like a Gartner or Forrester or something like that, they will take the number of companies times the number of IT employees and how much the spend is per each one of those. And they'll come up with a particular number. And it's at least an accurate, what I would consider a bottom threshold. But if you actually went to a company, a Fortune 100 company, pick on Disney again, if you went to them and said, look, I can actually affect this kind of change and I can show it and I can prove it, the upper bound of how much they'll spend really is not capped. It's only capped by, well, what's the loss that I could potentially run into? And if you want to go talk to the large cyber insurers that are out there today, the Chubbs and so forth, they'll tell you that the insured value is actually in the trillions of dollars. And if they could actually, they're not going to spend more than it's worth, whatever that protection is, but they'll spend up to a percentage of that. And that, what it's actually worth, is really measured in the trillions of dollars. So the upper bound, I don't know that it's necessarily limited in the traditional way that we would think about this kind of market sizing.
Wow. Well, so Jonathan, I try to keep this under 30 minutes, but this has been really, really interesting. I'd love to have you on again sometime. Just as a kind of closing statement, is there anything, if people want to follow you and hear what you're up to, or if, they want to track you on social media, whatever, you got something to say about that?
I've got a little bit on LinkedIn, but not too much. I'm not a super social guy, but I love talking about this in case you can't tell. It's something I've lived and breathed and bled over the past almost 30 years. It's interesting to me, but I love having conversations about this. So all I'm really looking for is someone who's willing to listen. Thanks for your questions. You've got some really good ones in there. Certainly appreciate it. I can tell that you've definitely thought about this before, but it is certainly a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah. Well, to all the listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in, and please subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again, Jonathan.